Trump's obsession with making Canada his 51st state is about to meet its match, and it's not going the way he planned. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney is heading to the White House next week, and this meeting could expose just how desperate Trump's annexation threats have become. While Trump thinks he's playing power politics, Carney has already turned Trump's own aggression into his greatest political weapon. So what's really happening behind the scenes of this high-stakes diplomatic showdown? And why is Trump's strategy backfiring so spectacularly? To understand how we got here, we need to rewind to the beginning of Trump's second term. When Trump took office in January, he immediately launched what can only be described as an economic assault on America's closest ally. He slapped a brutal 25% tariff on Canadian cars and parts. Followed by punishing levies on steel, aluminum, and energy, the message was clear: submit to American demands or watch your economy crumble.
Well, if it's true, it certainly represents a breakthrough. You have to remember in context that we have the lowest tariff rates in the world at about 5%. That's because most of the products which cross the border are CUSMA compliant. The problem is that there are some exceptions which the United States have carved out that are at 50%, and that includes steel and aluminum. And for those particular industries, they're being really hard done by. But we have reason to believe that the United States is suffering as well from the steel and aluminum tariffs. In the case of aluminum, probably close to 75% of the aluminum used in the United States comes from Canada, which is really accelerating the cost for a lot of commodities within the United States and putting pressure on the government to find a compromise. So it wouldn't be surprised if there was some movement on those two commodities.
But Trump didn't stop there. He began openly talking about annexing Canada, repeatedly calling it America's 51st state. In interviews and public appearances, he suggested using economic force to absorb Canada into the United States. These weren't casual remarks. They were calculated threats designed to intimidate a nation that sends more than 75% of its exports to the U.S. The impact was immediate and devastating. Canada's unemployment rate hit 7.1% in August, the highest level since May 2016, excluding the pandemic period. Nearly 3.6 billion Canadian dollars worth of goods and services crossed the border each day, and Trump's tariffs were strangling that lifeline. Canadian businesses were hemorrhaging money, workers were losing jobs, and the entire Canadian economy was reeling. Trump clearly believed his strategy was working. He had Canada exactly where he wanted them, economically dependent and politically vulnerable. The plan seemed simple: squeeze Canada until they begged for mercy, then dictate terms from a position of absolute strength. What Trump didn't anticipate was that his aggression would create the very resistance he was trying to crush. Enter Mark Carney, a former central banker who had never held elected office before. When Prime Minister Justin Trudeau resigned in January, Carney stepped up to lead the center-left Liberal Party. At the time, the Liberals were trailing badly in the polls, facing what looked like certain electoral defeat. The Conservative Party was the clear frontrunner, and many expected them to cruise to victory. But then something extraordinary happened. Instead of cowering under Trump's pressure, Carney did the exact opposite. He turned Trump into his campaign's greatest asset. Carney ran an explicitly anti-Trump campaign, warning Canadians that their southern neighbor wanted to steal their country. On election night, with crowds chanting, never in response to Trump's annexation threats, Carney declared, "America wants our land, our resources, our water, our country."
Yes. I mean, I think the domestic situation for the prime minister is that there's a sense that he was hired in the election to deal with this very issue, that he was going to be the chief negotiator. He had a special power or a special set of experiences or skills in order to deal with this type of situation. But at the same time, I don't think anybody really thinks that he's some kind of Trump whisperer and he's going to be able to change necessarily what the president does. And so I think the expectations of him are not just about dealing with Trump, it's also about dealing with the fallout, dealing with the economic realities if we aren't able to get a deal with Trump. At this point, it just doesn't seem like, I don't know if we've made any progress at all with this. I don't know if any of these talks, any of these missions that delegates have gone down, including Minister LeBlanc, to go and have these conversations, is there any reason for us to think that there's going to be a breakthrough moment now? And I think it's going to get...
These are not idle threats. President Trump is trying to break us so that America can own us. That will never, ever happen. The results were stunning. The Liberal Party, which had been written off just months earlier, won 169 seats out of 343, enough to form a minority government and keep Carney as prime minister. It was a complete reversal of fortune, and experts agree that Trump's aggressive rhetoric was the primary driver of this political comeback. As one Cornell University professor noted, President Trump single-handedly helped the Liberal Party recover from a very large popular opinion deficit in Canada to win the election, ironically. Trump had inadvertently created his own worst nightmare, a Canadian leader with a Democratic mandate to resist American pressure. Worse yet, Carney's victory sent a clear message to the world that Trump's bullying tactics could backfire spectacularly. Instead of intimidating Canada into submission, Trump had energized Canadian nationalism and created a leader who owed his political success to standing up to American aggression. Carney immediately began implementing what he called an elbows-up strategy, a hockey term for defensive play. He made it clear that the old relationship we had with the United States, based on deepening integration of our economies and tight security and military cooperation, is over. He declared that it's clear the U.S. is no longer a reliable partner and began actively seeking alternatives to American dependence. This wasn't just rhetoric. Carney started courting other Western allies, making his first foreign trips as prime minister to the UK and France, rather than the traditional first visit to Washington. He began collaborating with Australia on new radar systems for the Arctic. Reports emerged of South Korean companies pitching military equipment sales to Canada, significant because Canada had historically gotten most of their defense products from the U.S. Meanwhile, Trump's economic warfare was achieving the opposite of its intended effect. Rather than forcing Canada to capitulate, it was pushing them to diversify away from American markets and suppliers. Canada began dropping some of its retaliatory tariffs to match U.S. exemptions under the USMCA trade agreement. But this wasn't surrender. It was strategic repositioning. The first face-to-face meeting between Trump and Carney in May revealed just how dramatically the power dynamic had shifted. Trump, perhaps recognizing that his strategy had backfired, tried to take credit for Carney's electoral success. "I think I was probably the greatest thing that happened to him," Trump said, with characteristic lack of self-awareness. But when Trump immediately brought up annexation during their Oval Office meeting, Carney's response was devastating in its simplicity. As you know from real estate, there are some places that are never for sale. Trump's reply, "Never say never," only reinforced how out of touch he was with the new reality. Carney later revealed that he had privately asked Trump to stop calling Canada the 51st state, but Trump's public statements made it clear he had no intention of backing down. The American president seemed genuinely unable to understand that his threats were strengthening rather than weakening Canadian resolve. The timing of the meeting is particularly significant because it coincides with Trump's renewed push for his Golden Dome missile defense program. Trump recently claimed that Canada had called asking to be covered by the proposed missile shield, to which he responded, "Well, why don't you just join our country, become the 51st state, and you get it for free?"
To which I said, well, why don't you just join our country? You become 51, become the 51st state, and you get it for free.
Canada's point person on U.S. trade says he's optimistic some sort of agreement can still be reached as industry deals with biting tariffs on the steel, aluminum, auto, and lumber sectors.
This latest iteration of his annexation theme shows that Trump still doesn't understand how counterproductive his rhetoric has become. Now, as Carney prepares for his return to the White House next week, the stakes couldn't be higher. The meeting comes ahead of a crucial review of the USMCA trade agreement scheduled for 2026. And both sides know that the outcome could reshape North American economics for decades.
All this, and I say, though, that the biggest elephant in the room here is the uncertainty that both economies are going to continue to face for the duration of these negotiations. These CRISPR negotiations could go on for many years at this point. The way CRISPR is designed is that starting in 2026, the three countries essentially have to continuously negotiate to try to find an agreement to extend the trade framework. And until they do so, they're going to kind of continuously be negotiating. And so, while 2036 is a long way away, I think it is very difficult for businesses, especially manufacturers in all three countries, to commit to making any kind of big decisions until they have some more certainty about where things are headed. And so I see, the biggest kind of source of economic drag, in Canada, but also in the United States, is going to be, automakers and other big manufacturers, I think, are going to hesitate to make big investment decisions for, as long as these negotiations are taking place.
But the context has fundamentally changed since their last encounter. Carney is no longer the untested newcomer trying to prove himself on the world stage. He's now a leader who has demonstrated that Trump's intimidation tactics can be turned into political gold. He arrives in Washington with a clear mandate from Canadian voters to resist American pressure, and he's already shown he's willing to use that mandate. The risks for both leaders are enormous. For Carney, there's the danger that Trump will try to publicao, embarrass him by raising the 51st state issue again. As one political science professor noted, a key political risk is that President Trump raises the 51st state issue again and seeks to publicly embarrass Prime Minister Carney during his visit. There's also the domestic political risk that if no apparent progress on trade is made, conservative opponents will accuse Carney of failing to address the ongoing trade war. But the risks for Trump may be even greater. His entire approach to Canada has been based on the assumption that economic pressure would eventually force capitulation. That strategy has not only failed, but has actively strengthened his opposition. If this meeting produces no breakthroughs, or worse, if it becomes another public relations disaster, it will further expose the limitations of Trump's transactional approach to international relations. By framing the relationship in terms of dominance and submission rather than mutual benefit, he creates political constraints that didn't exist before.
Prime Minister Carney has a big agenda item, and that is to get back to somehow normalizing relations around trade and talking about how we ensure the continuation of the USMCA. But as that clip just demonstrates, as long as this continued reference to the 51st state remains foremost in the president's mind, this is not an atmosphere that is going to make these type of negotiations easy, and it's something that absolutely enrages Canadians and isn't going to happen, by the way, actually.
True that, sir. The point being that the president, of course, raising this issue just a few days ago, and now the prime minister going ahead and meeting with him. Do you believe this is really going to be a part of the conversation when there is so much more at stake? We've been discussing this for weeks, sir, whether it's steel, whether it's aluminum, our auto sector. The president has now spoken of lumber, pharmaceuticals, etc. You think 50...
What makes this situation even more remarkable is how completely Trump has misread the Canadian political landscape. His assumption that economic pressure would create political pressure for accommodation ignored the deep wells of Canadian nationalism that his threats would inevitably tap. Canadians may be economically dependent on the United States, but they are fiercely protective of their sovereignty, something Trump either didn't understand or chose to ignore. The broader implications extend far beyond North American trade relations. Trump's failure in Canada demonstrates the limitations of his preferred negotiating style when dealing with democratic allies. Unlike authoritarian leaders who can ignore public opinion, democratic leaders like Carney are accountable to voters who may actually be energized by foreign pressure rather than intimidated by it. This dynamic has already influenced Canadian policy in ways that work against American interests. Canada's pivot toward other allies, its exploration of alternative defense suppliers, and its growing skepticism about American reliability all stem directly from Trump's aggressive approach. Instead of creating a more compliant neighbor, Trump has created a more independent one. As the meeting approaches, both sides are managing expectations carefully. Carney has already told reporters not to expect white smoke, a reference to the signal that goes up when a new pope is chosen, suggesting that major breakthroughs are unlikely. This measured approach reflects Carney's understanding that his political strength comes from being seen as someone who can stand up to Trump, not someone who caves to American pressure. Trump, meanwhile, continues to project confidence despite the obvious failure of his strategy. His recent comments suggesting that everyone wants to make a deal with America, they all want to make a deal because we have something that they all want, reveal a fundamental misunderstanding of the changed dynamics. Carney doesn't need a deal with Trump. His political success has come from successfully resisting Trump. The meeting will also test whether Trump has learned anything from his previous failures. His tendency to make inflammatory statements and create unnecessary confrontations has already backfired once with Canada. If he repeats those mistakes, he risks further strengthening Carney's position while undermining his own credibility. For Canada, the meeting represents an opportunity to demonstrate that small countries can successfully resist pressure from larger neighbors through smart politics and strategic communication. Carney's success in turning Trump's aggression into electoral gold has provided a template that other nations facing American pressure might choose to follow. The economic fundamentals underlying the relationship remain unchanged. Canada is still the top export destination for 36 U.S. states, and about 60% of U.S. crude oil imports come from Canada. Canada is also the largest foreign supplier of steel, aluminum, and uranium to the U.S., and has 34 critical minerals and metals that the Pentagon considers essential for national security. These realities mean that despite the political tensions, both countries have strong incentives to find workable solutions. But Trump's approach has made those solutions much harder to achieve. By framing the relationship in terms of dominance and submission rather than mutual benefit, he has created political constraints that didn't exist before. Carney can't be seen as capitulating to American demands without undermining the very nationalism that brought him to power. The irony is that Trump's tactics might have worked better with a different approach. If he had focused on mutual benefits and respected Canadian sovereignty while pushing for better trade terms, he might have found a more receptive audience. Instead, his threats and ultimatums activated Canadian nationalism and created a political dynamic that works against American interests. As we watch this diplomatic drama unfold, the broader lesson is clear. In an interconnected world where democratic leaders must answer to their voters, bullying tactics often backfire. Trump's assumption that economic leverage automatically translates into political compliance has been thoroughly disproven by the Canadian experience. The meeting next week will show whether Trump has learned from his mistakes or whether he'll double down on a failed strategy. For Carney, it's another opportunity to demonstrate that standing up to American pressure isn't just good politics, it's effective policy. The world will be watching to see which approach ultimately prevails.